In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And one warrior, whose first scar appeared 3 days after he killed the thing that cannot die, a thin line under the skin, tracing exactly where Lucius's saber had passed. Laraman's cells should have sealed it clean. They had sealed every wound he'd ever taken. This one scarred. Months later, the marks started appearing on his arms, in places no blade had ever touched. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from a space marine who won the duel every warrior dreams of winning. He'll tell you time has become unreliable, whole watches vanish, and he comes to standing somewhere he doesn't remember walking to, fingers pressing into his own skin like he's looking for something buried underneath. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin.
The first scar appeared 3 days after I killed the thing that cannot die. A thin line, like a thread of wire, pulled beneath my skin, tracing a path from the corner of my left eye down to my jaw. The same line that Lucius's saber had traced during our duel. Laraman's cells should have sealed it clean. They had sealed every wound I had ever taken clean. But this one scarred. I stood in the quarantine chamber aboard the Relentless Virtue, looked at my reflection in polished surgical steel, and did not recognize what looked back. I had not changed yet, not in any way that would alarm the apothecary or draw the librarian's attention. But something behind my own face had shifted, something behind the eyes. At the time, I told myself that a blade wielded by a servant of a god was simply harder to heal, and I did not think about it again. Not until the marks began appearing on my arms months later, in places where no blade had ever touched me. All of that was a long time ago now. Time has become unreliable. The cold cycles in the stone are the only clock I have left, and they lie. An hour passes, and I would swear on the bones of Rogel Dawn that I have lived through 3. Other times, whole watches vanish, and I come to standing somewhere I do not remember walking to, my fingers tracing patterns across my forearm, pressing into my own skin like I am looking for something buried underneath. What they told us about the curse of Lucius the Eternal was wrong, not in the mechanics. Those were accurate enough. Kill the soul thief, feel even a moment of satisfaction, become his next vessel. Simple, clean, the kind of threat you can plan around. That is what they told me, and that is what I believed, and that belief is the reason I am going to die screaming inside the armor of a thing I was built to destroy. They chose me because I could not feel. That is the truth of it, stripped bare, no dignity left to protect. The Hollow Saints are not a chapter given to sentiment. We are siege breakers, wall holders, grinders of bone and ceramite, founded from the stock of the Imperial Fists, Dorn's blood in our veins, Dorn's stubbornness in our marrow, and stationed on Calthamir, a world of ossuaries and silence where the dead outnumber the living 10,000 to 1. Our fortress monastery sits atop the Pale Stacks, a mountain of compressed human remains 3 kilometers high, packed tight by geological pressure over the millennia until it became something closer to calcium stone than bone. We train in its catacombs. We meditate in its reliquaries. We bury our dead inside the dead of ages past, layering warrior upon civilian upon warrior in a stratigraphy of service. It teaches us something that most chapters learn through doctrine or hypnoconditioning. We learn it by breathing it. Everything ends. Everyone becomes a layer. Sentiment is a luxury afforded to those who have not yet accepted that fact. I accepted it young. earlier than most, even by the standards of a chapter that initiates its aspirants in tombs. I was pulled from the understacks at 9 standard years, a tunnel rat who mapped and maintained the deeper ossuary networks beneath the fortress, clearing collapses, cataloging remains, marking structural fractures in the bone stone for the chapter serfs to repair. I do not remember my parents. I do not remember having parents. What I remember is the dark and the weight of the dead pressing in on every side, and the understanding that came with it, wordless and complete, that I was a temporary arrangement of matter passing through a permanent landscape of ended things. My favorite place, if someone incapable of favorites can be said to have one, was a small spherical chamber deep in the oldest stratum, a hollow in the bone stone, perfectly round, smooth-walled, formed by some ancient geological process, or perhaps by something older still. I would sit in it when the shifts ended and the other tunnel rats went to eat. It was dark. It was silent. It was nothing, and I fit inside it perfectly because I was nothing too. That is not philosophy. That is geography. The chaplains saw something in me during the trials. I did not flinch. Not from pain, not from fear, not from the psych evaluations that reduced 3 of my cohort to screaming wrecks who had to be put down. I passed through every gate of selection the way water passes through a crack in stone, not through force, not through courage, but through a fundamental absence of resistance. When they cut open my chest to implant the first of the gene seed organs, I watched the apothecary's hands without a pulse increase. When they sealed me inside a sensory deprivation chamber for 7 days as part of the final trial, I did not hallucinate. I did not pray. I counted my own heartbeats until they became meaningless, and then I stopped counting, and then I simply existed in the dark, neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, until they opened the hatch and told me I had passed. I became a battle brother of the Hollow Saints at the age of 16 standard years, and I served for 143 years before I killed Lucius the Eternal on a world called Vossk Tertius. The chaplains flagged my condition in the first decade and reviewed it 4 times. Each review concluded the same thing. A brother who feels no fear cannot break. A brother who feels no anger cannot be goaded. And a brother who feels no pride cannot be tempted. What the ecclesiarchy would have called a spiritual defect, the Hollow Saints classified as an operational asset and stopped examining. Nobody tried to fix me. In that time, I fought in 39 major engagements, 17 boarding actions, 4 crusades, and an inquisitorial suppression campaign that I am still technically forbidden from discussing, though that seems like a small concern given my current situation. I held ranks ranging from line brother to squad sergeant to sword champion, the last of which is the position I occupied when this story begins, and the position I will never occupy again. Sword champion is a formal rank within the Hollow Saints, answering to the chapter master directly. The role exists for a single purpose: to kill things that ordinary methods cannot kill. I carried a relic blade called Terminus Absolute, a 2-handed power sword forged in the fires of Calthemir's core by the chapter's founding master of the forge. Its edge was layered with sanctified silver and null-warded hexagrammic script, and it had killed 4 greater demons, an orc war boss the size of a dreadnought, an Aeldari autarch who had lived for 11,000 years, and a Hrud entropy field projector that technically was not alive but disagreed strongly with that assessment. It was a weapon designed for ending things that did not want to end. I thought that made it the right tool for Lucius. I was correct about the blade. I was wrong about everything else. The mission came down from the Ordo Hereticus through our chapter master, Gravith Chiron, a warrior whose face looked like it had been carved from the same compressed calcium as the pale stacks and who spoke with the warmth and frequency of a funeral bell. Gravith had held his position for 200 years and had smiled exactly once in my presence, when he received confirmation that a word-bearer strike cruiser had been destroyed with all hands. The smile lasted approximately 1.5 seconds. I counted. It was a notable event. The briefing took place in the reclusium, beneath the petrified ribcage of an ancient hive whale that served as the chamber's vaulted ceiling. Present were Graveth, myself, Chief Librarian Sethrin Vane, Apothecary Torsk, Chaplain Drovek, and a woman who introduced herself only as Interrogator Hale. She was Ordo Hereticus, compact and precise, with augmetic eyes that clicked when they refocused, and a voice like someone reading a verdict. Interrogator Hale laid out the situation with the mechanical efficiency of a woman who had briefed kill teams before and expected most of them to die. A warband of the Emperor's children, estimated at company strength, had been operating in the Vossk Reach for approximately 8 months. They had struck 3 worlds, Vossk Primus, Vossk Secundus, and the Agri world of Delis Reach, leaving characteristic devastation behind: mass mutilation, forced sensory alteration of civilian populations, the construction of what the Inquisition politely termed experiential architectures, buildings designed to cause physical and psychological pain through their very geometry, their angles calculated to induce specific frequencies of suffering in the human nervous system. The Emperor's children were nothing if not precise in their cruelty, she said. They had elevated atrocity to an aesthetic. The warband was led by Lucius the Eternal. That name changed the temperature of the room. Gravith's jaw tightened by a fraction. Sethrin Vane's psychic hood flickered. Chaplain Drovek's grip shifted on his Crozius, the unconscious reflex of a man reaching for something holy when something unholy has entered the conversation. The only person in the room who did not react was me. And that, as it turned out, was exactly the point. Interrogator Hale pulled up hololithic after hololithic of sealed inquisitorial records. The curse of Lucius the Eternal, documented across 10 millennia, kill reports, transformation logs, apothecary examinations of victims mid-change. She showed us picked captures of a Black Templar's champion named Escovar, who had beheaded Lucius in single combat during a boarding action in the Gethithis cluster 4 centuries ago. The first capture showed a warrior in immaculate black and white plate, holding the severed head of the soul thief aloft in triumph. The second capture, taken 8 days later, showed the same warrior, but his face was wrong. The jaw had shifted, scar tissue was branching across his cheeks like river deltas viewed from orbit. His eyes, the inquisitorial report noted, had changed color from dark brown to a pale violet. The third capture was listed as the final record. It showed a suit of Baroque, screaming armor standing where Escovar had been. Lucius the Eternal, reborn, another face pressed into the howling ceramite of his plate. The mechanism was well understood, Hale told us. Slanesh, the Dark Prince, the god of excess, had blessed Lucius with a specific form of immortality. The killer had to feel satisfaction, pride, pleasure, any form of positive emotional response to the act of ending Lucius's life. If they did, even unconsciously, even for a fraction of a second, the transformation would begin. The killer's flesh would warp. Their identity would erode. Lucius would emerge from them like something hatching from a cocoon, and the killer's soul would be compressed into a screaming, conscious face on the armor of shrieking souls, aware and suffering for eternity. The scope was broad, absurdly broad. There were records of warriors who had felt no satisfaction in the kill itself, only to be consumed because they felt relief that the battle was over. A munitions worker on a forge world who had never laid eyes on Lucius had been transformed because the shell she had manufactured, the one that happened to kill him during a bombardment, had been made with professional pride. She had taken satisfaction in doing her job well, and that had been enough. Hale paused to let this settle. A munitions worker, someone who did not know Lucius existed, someone whose only crime was competence. There was one documented case of a Necron, a machine construct of living metal, killing Lucius and subsequently being overtaken. The theory was that even the Necron had retained some vestige of cold pride in its function, some echo of the being it had been before biotransference stripped away its organic form. Previous attempts to exploit emotionless operatives had failed, Hale acknowledged. The Death Watch had deployed a brother whose neural architecture had been accidentally stripped by a malfunctioning Mechanicus mind wipe procedure 6 centuries ago. No emotions, no psychic signature, nothing but trained reflexes and motor function. He killed Lucius on Thelina Reach without registering a spike on any known metric. 23 days later, the transformation completed. An Inquisitor Lord had tried a lobotomized combat servitor, hardwired for a single kill stroke. Same result. Hale's augmetic eyes clicked twice as she delivered the distinction. In both prior cases, the operative's null state had been artificially induced. Surgical, chemical, mechanical. The neural architecture had been destroyed, not dormant. There was nothing left to reactivate. Haereth's condition, she said, was different. His null state was organic, the product of psychological damage, not surgical intervention. The pathways still existed. They were simply unpowered. There was no suppression mechanism to reverse, no artificial barrier to circumvent. His emptiness was genuine. Drovek spoke then, for the only time in the briefing. He asked about the other claws. Hale's eyes clicked. She had been waiting for it, I think, the way a woman waits for a question she has already decided how to answer. The oldest surviving commentary on the curse, she said, appended to a Sororitas testament, recovered in M38 and cross-referenced in 4 subsequent inquisitorial abstracts, held that Lucius could be permanently destroyed by one condition alone, not by emptiness, by mercy. The testament argued, and she was careful to frame it as argument, not doctrine, because the Ordo does not pretend to understand the arithmetic of gods, that a killer who took the soul thief's life, carrying nothing in their soul but pity for him, would break the cycle. The reasoning offered was that pity is the only response to Lucius that refuses him. Every other emotion grants him something. Pity denies that there is anything there worth granting. The reclusium was quiet for a moment. Then Graveth asked whether the Ordo had ever attempted it. Twice, Hale said. Neither attempt had involved sending a merciful soul against Lucius in single combat, because the Ordo is not stupid. Both times they had positioned a candidate, one a hospitaller, one an anchorite of some minor ecclesiarchy sect, in the rear echelon of a war zone where Lucius was expected to fall to massed fire, in the hope of arranging a coup de grace delivered by the right hands. Both times the timing failed. The first candidate died in the initial bombardment. The second reached the body 11 minutes after a Sentinel pilot had already put a Lascanin through it, and by then the transformation had a claimant. Mercy, Hyle observed, is not a martial discipline, and war zones do not schedule themselves around the arrival of gentle people. That is the shape of the trap. The condition that would end him can only be met by someone who has no business being anywhere near him. Nobody in the room suggested that the Hollow Saints might produce such a person. We were a chapter raised in tombs, taught before we could read that sentiment is a luxury for those who have not yet accepted that everything ends. We had no mercy to send. We had emptiness, and emptiness was the closest thing in our armory. I sat with that assessment. It was clinically accurate and completely wrong about why it mattered. The rules did not matter. The curse worked because it wanted to work, and they were asking me to kill Lucius anyway. Graveth spoke for the first time since Hale had begun her briefing. He did not ask if I was willing. He did not ask if I understood the risks. He asked a single question, directed at Sethrin Vane, our chief librarian. "Can he feel anything?" Vane looked at me, not with his eyes, with his psycher's sight, the deep scan that goes past flesh and bone and engineered muscle into whatever space the soul occupies. I felt the touch of his mind against mine like a cold hand pressed flat against a window, searching, testing the glass for cracks. "No," Vane said after a long pause. "The satisfaction pathways are not suppressed. They are absent. He is not restraining his emotions. He does not have them. If anyone can kill Lucius without triggering the curse, it is him." I sat there and listened to a man describe the inside of my mind to a room full of people who would decide whether to send me to die based on his diagnosis. I felt nothing about it. And that was that. No vote, no ceremony. Graveth asked one further question. What the Vossk reach would cost the Imperium if the warband continued unchecked for another 8 months. And Hale answered with a figure that included 2 forge worlds and the tithe corridor that supplied the Calthamir system's ammunition. Graveth did the arithmetic in his head, the way he did all arithmetic, and arrived at the conclusion that a sword champion is a replaceable asset and a tithe corridor is not. He nodded once. Drovek blessed my blade. Torsk fitted me with a suite of biometric monitors that would track my neurochemistry in real time, broadcasting data to the relentless Virtues Apothecarion so they could watch for any spike in serotonin, dopamine, or any of the other chemical signatures associated with emotional response. The suite included 17 sensors. Torsk said 18 would have been preferable, but one was being used on a training servitor. I did not ask which of us was the control group. Hale handed me a sealed data slate containing everything the Inquisition knew about Lucius's combat patterns, weapon capabilities, and tactical preferences. I took the slate. I checked the seals. I walked out of the Reclusium and began preparing for a duel with the most dangerous swordsman in the galaxy. The deck plates were solid beneath my boots. The recycled air was thin against my skin. The handle of Terminus Absolute sat balanced and familiar in my gauntlet, a tool for a job. I felt none of the things that warriors are supposed to feel before they walk into legend. That was all. I think now that something in the warp heard the librarian's diagnosis. I think it laughed, not because the diagnosis was wrong, because it was exactly right, and that made what was coming so much more exquisite. The relentless virtue translated into the Vossk system 14 days after the briefing. I spent those 14 days the way I spent all transit periods, in the practice cages, drilling forms against servitor opponents, running the same blade sequences I had executed 10,000 times until the movements existed outside of conscious thought, until my body was simply a delivery system for the sword, and the sword was simply an extension of the ship's mission parameters. Drill, eat, sleep, drill. The servitors broke with reliable frequency. The chapter serfs replaced them with reliable efficiency. I did not think about Lucius. I reviewed Interrogator Hale's data slate exactly once. committing the relevant tactical information to memory in the way that Astartes do, complete, permanent, filed alongside the other 10,000 combat profiles I had absorbed over my career. Lucius fought with a power saber and a daemonic whip called the Lash of Torment. The whip was semi-sentient, capable of independent targeting and bone-shattering constriction. His armor augmented his already transhuman speed with combat stimulants injected from a Comorite stim rack, dark Eldar technology embedded in his flesh by Fabius Bile. He fought in a style that the inquisitorial analysts described as polymorphic, incorporating combat techniques from every warrior whose soul had been absorbed into his armor. 10,000 years of accumulated martial knowledge drawn from loyalist Astartes, traitors, Xenos warlords, and human champions. Every time someone killed him and was consumed, he came back knowing everything they knew. The data slate contained combat footage. I watched it once. Lucius moved the way fire moves, the way water moves. Not with force, but with an absolute commitment to the path of least resistance between himself and the target's death. His saber work was precise to a degree that made my own look mechanical, and I was supposed to be one of the finest blades in the chapter. His footwork was alien, patterns that no human fighting tradition had produced, borrowed from Eldari duelists and Drukhari arena fighters, and things that had no name in any language I spoke. He did not fight to win. He fought to experience. Each cut was a performance, each parry a punctuation mark in a sentence of violence that he was composing in real time. And the joy on his ruined face, that scarred, self-mutilated face, split by a grin that reached from ear to ear, was the most disturbing thing I had ever observed in 143 years of war. I adjusted 3 of my blade sequences to account for the whip's independent attack pattern. I went back to drilling. The servitors did not improve. Torsk, the apothecary, checked my biometric monitors twice daily. On the 3rd day of transit, he stopped by the practice cage and watched me work through a sequence against 3 combat servitors simultaneously. When I finished, he stood there for a moment with his auspex in hand, reading the same 3 lines over and over, as though repetition might change them. "Your cortisol is flat," he said. "Adrenaline response is minimal, even during high-intensity drills. Serotonin baseline is the lowest I have recorded in any living Astartes." Is that a problem? It would be for anyone else. For this mission, it might be the only reason you come back. He paused. I could see him considering whether to say something else. Torsk was someone who checked my blood work and occasionally made conversation while doing it. By the standards of the Hollow Saints, that was practically an intimate relationship. "When you kill him," Torsk said, "feel nothing." "That is what I do." "I know. I am reminding you that this time it matters." I nodded. He left. I resumed drilling. We dropped out of warp translation at the system's edge and ran silent toward Vossk Tertius for 6 hours. The planet was a mining world, or had been. The data said it supported a population of 800,000, most concentrated in 3 extraction hubs built around the primary ore deposits. Long-range augur scans showed that 2 of the 3 hubs were still standing. The 3rd was producing energy signatures that the ship's sensorium officer described as anomalous, and then, after running the readings through a secondary filter, corrected to obscene. He did not elaborate. His face suggested that elaboration would have required a vocabulary he did not possess and did not want to acquire. We made planetfall in a Thunderhawk at dusk, local time. Myself, a tactical squad under Sergeant Polev, and Librarian Vane in a support capacity. Vane's orders were specific: He was not to engage Lucius. He was there to monitor my psychic state during and after the kill, to detect any early signs of the curse taking hold, and if necessary, to end me before the transformation could complete. He carried a force staff and a bolt pistol loaded with Psycannon rounds. He did not discuss the contingency plan with me. He did not need to. I had read the same briefing documents he had. Vossk Tertius smelled wrong. That was the first thing I noticed as the Thunderhawk's assault ramp dropped and we moved into the open air. Not the smell of death, though there was death here in quantities that would have overwhelmed a normal human's senses. It was something else. A sweetness beneath the decay, like rotting fruit or spilled wine, thick and cloying and somehow warm, as if the air itself had been altered at the molecular level to carry pleasure alongside the horror. The atmosphere tasted of copper and sugar. My autosenses flagged trace chemical compounds that the system could not identify. Airborne substances that existed outside the known toxicological indexes, synthesized by processes that had nothing to do with chemistry and everything to do with the warp. Polev's squad fanned out in standard sweep formation. We moved through the ruins of the third hab, extraction point Tertius Gamma, according to the pre-invasion cartographic data. In practice, it was no longer recognizable as a human settlement. The Emperor's children had rebuilt it, not destroyed it. Rebuilt it. The hab structures were still standing, but their geometry had been altered. Walls had been reshaped into curves that should not have been load-bearing, but somehow were. Windows had been repositioned to create sight lines that forced the eye toward specific focal points. A junction where 3 corridors met, and the angles conspired to make the space seem to breathe. A plaza where the ground itself had been relaid in a spiral pattern that induced vertigo when you looked at it for more than a few seconds. The buildings were not damaged. They were improved, if your definition of improvement included driving their inhabitants insane. The people were still here. Some of them. I say people because there is no other word, though what had been done to them made the term generous. The Emperor's children had been operating on Vossk Tertius for 7 weeks, and in that time they had converted approximately 40% of the surviving population into what I can only describe as art installations. I'm going to describe what I saw because you need to understand what Lucius is, what the Emperor's children are, before you can understand why what happened to me afterward is so much worse. They had taken miners and hab workers and turned them into living instruments. Not noise marines. Those were something else, something born of Astartes' physiology and warp-forged sonic technology. These were ordinary humans whose nervous systems had been surgically rerouted so that every sensation, touch, sight, sound, taste, pain, fed into the same neural pathway. The result was a creature that could not distinguish between stimulus types. Light was taste, sound was pressure, pain was color. They stumbled through the altered corridors in groups of 10 or 20, moving in patterns that seemed random until you realized they were generating harmonics with their footsteps, their breathing, their involuntary moans. A chorus of confused sensation that resonated with the modified architecture and produced sounds at frequencies that made your teeth ache and your vision swim. Some had been further modified, extra nerve clusters grafted into exposed flesh, additional sensory organs, crude things, wet and glistening, nothing like the elegant implants of Mechanicus augmentation, growing from their shoulders, their backs, their faces. One woman had 8 ears arranged in a crown around her skull, each one tuned to a different frequency band. She walked in circles endlessly, her head tilted at an angle that suggested she was listening to something none of us could hear. Her mouth was open. She was smiling. The smile was the worst part, because it was genuine. Whatever they had done to her brain, she was experiencing something that her rerouted nervous system interpreted as pleasure, ecstasy even. Her body was a ruin, her mind was in paradise. I catalogued these observations with clinical precision. My biometric monitors registered no spike, the modifications were noted, the tactical implications assessed. The altered civilians were not hostile, but their movement patterns could compromise a firing line, and I moved on. Polev was less composed. I could hear his breathing change over the squad Vox, the slight elevation in respiration rate that indicated controlled disgust. His men were disciplined, hollow saints, all of them, raised in ossuaries and trained to endure, but several of them faltered at the intersection where we found the children. I am not going to describe what had been done to the children. There are things that serve no purpose in the telling. I will say only that the Emperor's children had not spared them, and that the modifications were, if anything, more elaborate, because smaller bodies required more precise work. Moved on, kept my blade loose in its scabbard, checked my flanks, swept corridors. We were hunting, and the prey was close. Sethrin Vane stopped me at the edge of a collapsed manufactorum, 2 blocks from the Hab's central plaza. His psychic hood was pulsing in slow, irregular rhythms, and his eyes had gone white, a sign that he was reading the local warp currents rather than the material environment. "He is here," Vane said. "Ahead, in the plaza. He is not hiding." He would not hide. No, he is waiting. There are others with him. 8 Astartes in corrupted plate, noise marines, and something else. Something bound, a demonic presence leashed but active. Vane's white eyes turned toward me, and even through the warp sight I could see the concern. Haereth, he knows we are here. He has known since we made planetfall. This is not an ambush, it is an invitation. Then we should not be rude. Vane stared at me for a long moment. I am not sure he recognized it as a joke. Given my delivery, that was fair. We advanced to the plaza. The Emperor's children were arranged in a loose semicircle around its perimeter, their baroque armor gleaming with oils and unidentifiable fluids, their weapons a mishmash of ancient Legion equipment and dark Eldar-influenced modifications that made them look less like soldiers and more like surgical instruments given legs. Noise Marines, 3 of them, carried sonic blasters, cylindrical, ribbed weapons that hummed at a frequency just below audible, making the air in front of them shimmer. Their armor was a deep, bruised purple, trimmed in gold that had tarnished to the color of dried blood. Every surface was covered in sigils and carvings, intricate patterns that moved when you were not looking directly at them, shifting and writhing like living tattoos. And in the center, standing on a raised platform that had been a loading dock before the Emperor's children had converted it into something resembling a stage, was Lucius. The footage had not prepared me. The data slate had not prepared me. 143 years of warfare against every enemy the galaxy had seen fit to throw at the Hollow Saints had not prepared me. Lucius the Eternal was a sight that existed outside the normal parameters of threat assessment, not because he was more dangerous than other things I had fought, though he was, but because he was more real, more present. He occupied space with an intensity that made everything around him seem thin and provisional, like a painting viewed next to the actual object it depicted. He was tall for an Astartes, lean in a way that his corrupted physiology should not have allowed, every line of his body suggesting speed and precision rather than brute force. His armor, the armor of shrieking souls, was alive. Not figuratively. The ceramite plates were fused with screaming faces, dozens of them, pressed into the surface like death masks cast in the moment of final agony. They moved, mouths opened and closed, eyes rolled. Silent screams rippled across the armor's surface in waves, each face contorting independently, each one a separate consciousness trapped in an eternal moment of horror. 19 faces were visible on his breastplate alone. Champions, warriors, a few that did not look like warriors at all. A narrow, terrified face near his left pauldron that could have belonged to a scribe or an artisan. Someone who had never held a blade, consumed by the curse through some oblique chain of causation that Slanesh found amusing. His face was a ruin of self-inflicted scars, carved in patterns that followed no aesthetic I could recognize, crisscrossing in dense networks that made his features almost unreadable. His eyes, visible through the lattice of scar tissue, were the color of bruised lilac, bright and wet and utterly, completely alive. He was grinning. The grin was not for me. The grin was permanent, carved into his muscles by centuries of practiced cruelty, a fixed expression that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with habit. In his right hand, a power saber, curved and single-edged, its blade sheathed in a faint haze of disruption energy. In his left coiled loosely the lash of torment, a whip that moved on its own, its tip swaying in lazy patterns like a serpent tasting the air. He looked at me with the expression of a man examining a meal that had just arrived. "You," Lucius said, and his voice was beautiful. Not in the way a choir is beautiful or a sunset is beautiful, beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful when it catches the light at the exact angle required to blind you before it opens your throat. Resonant, layered. I could hear harmonics in it that should not have existed in a human larynx, sub-frequencies that vibrated in my sternum and made my secondary heart skip a beat. The voice of a thing that had spent 10,000 years refining the act of being perceived. You are the one they sent, the empty one, the hollow man from the hollow chapter. Oh, I have heard about you. Word travels even in the warp. Especially in the warp. My patron finds you very interesting. I drew Terminus Absolute. The null wards along its blade flickered to life, cold blue light tracing the hexagrammic script. I find you very dead, I said. Lucius laughed. It was the worst sound I had ever heard, because it was genuinely warm. Not yet, he said, but soon. That is the beautiful part. You will kill me. I can see it in the way you hold your sword. Competent, efficient, boring, but effective. You will cut me down, and you will feel nothing, because that is what you are. A nothing. A gap in the shape of a man. And for a few weeks, maybe even a few months, everyone will celebrate. The empty man beat the curse. The hollow warrior killed the unkillable. He tilted his head, and the scar tissue on his face shifted, and for a moment his expression was almost gentle, almost sympathetic. You are not the first, you know. The Death Watch tried it, 600 years ago. Found a brother who had been neural scrubbed by some mechanicus procedure gone wrong. No emotions, no psychic presence, nothing but meat and motor function. He killed me on Thelina Reach. Felt nothing. 23 days later, he was me again. Before that, an Inquisitor Lord tried using a servitor. A lobotomized combat servitor, hardwired for a single kill stroke. No mind, no soul, no satisfaction. And yet, he spread his arms, saber and whip wide, and the screaming faces on his armor rippled with something that looked almost like laughter. And yet, here I am, every time, Because my patron is cleverer than your plans. He stepped off the platform. The noise marines did not move. His warband watched with the glazed, satisfied expressions of addicts watching their supplier prepare a fix. "But here is the thing about empty vessels," Lucius said, walking toward me with the casual confidence of someone who has died more times than he can count and found each death to be a temporary inconvenience. "They exist to be filled." I did not respond. There was nothing to respond to. Lucius was performing, and the audience was not me. The audience was the thing in the warp that was watching through his eyes, savoring this moment the way a connoisseur savors the anticipation before the first sip. I raised my blade and advanced. The lash of torment struck first. It moved faster than anything organic should. A blur of barbed, semi-sentient cord that whipped out from Lucius's left hand and came at my head from an angle my combat training had no classification for. Not a high strike, not a low sweep. Something between, a trajectory that seemed to bend mid-flight, curving around my initial parry and scoring a line of fire across my right pauldron. The ceramite held barely. The barbs left grooves. I let the whip pass, did not chase it, did not try to catch or entangle it. The data slate had warned against that. The lash had killed warriors who tried to grapple with it. The thing constricted with enough force to pulverize Astartes' plate and liked to wrap around limbs and pull. Instead, I stepped inside its radius, closing the distance between myself and Lucius faster than he expected, and brought Terminus Absolute down in a two-handed overhead cut, aimed at his left collarbone. He parried with the saber. The impact traveled up my arms and into my shoulders, and I registered with purely mechanical interest that his parry was the single most technically proficient defensive action I had ever encountered. The angle of his blade, the timing, the precise degree of rotation he applied to deflect my force rather than absorb it, all of it was perfect. Not good. Perfect. The kind of perfection that should have made me feel something. Awe, perhaps, or professional admiration, or the cold recognition that I was outmatched. I felt the vibration in my wrists. I adjusted my angle. I struck again. The duel lasted 8 minutes and 43 seconds. I know this because my biometric monitors recorded it, and because Torsk replayed the data for me afterward, and because 8 minutes and 43 seconds is a long time to fight something that has been killing the galaxy's finest swordsmen for 10 millennia. In those 8 minutes, Lucius cut me 11 times. 3 were superficial, scoring lines across my armor that left marks but did not penetrate. 5 reached flesh, shallow wounds that my Laraman's cells sealed within seconds. 2 were serious, a thrust that punched through the joint seal at my left elbow and ground against bone, and a slashing cut across my abdomen that opened my body glove and the muscle beneath. The 11th cut was to my face, a precise, almost delicate stroke of his saber that opened a line from my right temple to my chin, missing my eye by 2 millimeters. He had the skill to take the eye. He chose to leave a mark instead, something that would still be there when the fight was over. He was playing with me. I knew it. He knew I knew it. The noise marines watched from the perimeter, swaying slightly, their enhanced senses drinking in every sound of blade meeting blade, every grunt of exertion, every wet noise of ceramic and steel parting flesh. To them, this was a concert. Lucius was the soloist. I did not play. I cut, I parried, I advanced, I retreated. No flourishes, no feints, no wasted motion. My style was imperial fists at its most fundamental, direct, heavy, and relentless. Where Lucius danced, I marched. Where he created art, I dug trenches. I was not trying to outfight him. I was not trying to match his skill. I was trying to outlast his patience. He was the greatest swordsman in the galaxy, fighting a wall. In the 6th minute, his rhythm changed. The playfulness dropped out of his movements like someone had cut a string. His strikes became harder, faster, less elegant. The lash of torment stopped making exploratory passes and started hammering at my guard with brute force. His grin did not change. It could not, carved as it was into his muscle memory. But something in his eyes shifted from amusement to something flatter. Boredom, I thought at the time. I have had a long while since then to reconsider that reading. In the 7th minute, he overextended. A lunging thrust, committed and powerful, aimed at the gap between my breastplate and gorget. Fast enough that a slower warrior would have died, but committed. Both feet forward, weight shifted past the center line, the lash thrown wide in an accompanying sweep that was meant to catch me if I dodged. I did not dodge. I stepped to the left inside the arc of the lash and pivoted. Terminus Absolute came around in a horizontal cut that started at my right hip and ended at his neck. I have replayed that moment more times than I can account for, and the conclusion I keep arriving at is one I did not have the equipment to reach on the day. The overextension was too clean. 10,000 years of accumulated technique, a man who had absorbed the fighting styles of Aeldari duelists and orc warlords and imperial champions, and he made an error that a first-year initiate is taught to punish. His weight went past the line by exactly enough. The lash swung wide by exactly enough. He opened his neck to a horizontal cut and left it open for the fraction of a second required. He did not lose patience with me. He held the door and waited for me to walk through it. The null wards on the blade flared as they bit into the armor of shrieking souls. The hexagrammic script blazed white-hot. The screaming faces on his breastplate shrieked audibly, their mouths stretching wide, their warp-sustained voices reaching a frequency that shattered the lenses in Polev's helmet and sent two of his marines staggering. The lash of torment spasmed and went rigid, then limp like a beheaded snake. Terminus Absolute passed through Lucius's neck with the clean resistance of a blade meeting meat and bone and nothing more. Whatever warp-borne protections his armor carried, the null wards cut through them. His head separated from his body at the 4th cervical vertebra and hit the plaza floor with a wet, heavy sound, rolling twice before coming to rest face up, the permanent grin still fixed in place, the lilac eyes still open. His body stood for a moment, headless, swaying. The armor of shrieking souls continued to scream, the faces contorting in what might have been ecstasy or agony. Then it collapsed, folding in on itself like a puppet with severed strings, and lay still in a spreading pool of blood so dark it was almost black. I stood over the corpse of Lucius the Eternal, the champion of Slaanesh, the soul thief, Fulgrim's finest blade, and I felt nothing. No triumph, no relief, no satisfaction, not even the grim acknowledgement that would come naturally to most warriors who had just survived a fight they had been calculated to lose. I felt the weight of my sword. I felt the pain of my wounds, clinical and navigable. I felt the blood running down my face from the cut he had given me, cooling in the evening air. The biometric monitors confirmed it. Flat line across every emotional indicator. Cortisol had spiked during the fight, a physical stress response, not an emotional one, and was already dropping. Serotonin, dopamine, endorphin levels, baseline, below baseline in some cases. Torsk, watching from the ship in orbit, transmitted a single word over the secure Vox channel. Clean. The noise marines reacted badly to Lucius's death, as expected. 3 of them opened fire immediately, their sonic blasters filling the plaza with walls of destructive sound that turned the altered architecture into a resonance chamber. Polev's squad returned fire. Sethrin Vane stepped forward and unleashed a focused psychic blast that liquefied the brain of the nearest noise marine inside his helmet. The fight lasted 90 seconds. All 8 Emperor's children were dead when it ended. One of Polev's marines had a ruptured eardrum and hairline fractures in his skull from the sonic weapons, but was ambulatory. The demonic presence that Vane had detected, the leashed thing, the something bound, was gone. I asked Vane about it as we withdrew to the extraction point. He scanned the area, frowned, scanned again. It departed the moment Lucius fell. It did not fight. It did not flee. It simply left, as if its purpose was observation, not combat. He was quiet for a moment. Something was watching to see what would happen. At the time, it seemed irrelevant. A demonic entity retreating after its master fell was hardly unusual. It was only later, much later, in the small hours of ship night, when I lay awake listening to sounds I should not have been able to find interesting, that I wondered whether the observer had been watching Lucius at all, or whether it had been watching me. I cleaned my blade on a piece of cloth torn from a dead heretic's tabard. I sheathed it. I walked back to the Thunderhawk without looking at the body. We lifted off, returned to the relentless virtue, and I submitted myself to quarantine. Standard protocol, Hale had insisted. 40 days of isolation, daily biometric and psychic scans, continuous monitoring for any physical or mental changes consistent with the curse's known transformation profile. I agreed without argument. The quarantine chamber had a cot, a waste unit, and a view of the apothecarion through reinforced armor glass. It was the most comfortable accommodation I had occupied in years, which said more about the Hollow Saints than about the chamber. Sethrin Vane visited me every 6 hours. He sat on the other side of a reinforced armor glass partition and scanned me with his psyker sight, his white eyes drifting across my body and the space around it, looking for warp taint, for the hooks and threads that Slanesh would use to begin pulling me apart. Each time, he found nothing. Each visit, the tension in his shoulders decreased by an increment so small that only someone who had spent 100 years in the same chapter would notice. But something else increased. His scans grew longer, not by much. An extra minute on the 3rd day, 2 extra on the 7th, 5 on the 12th. When I noted this, he explained that thoroughness demanded it. The standard approach might miss something novel, so he was developing new detection methodologies, expanding his psychic scan protocols to cover frequencies and resonance patterns that had never been documented. His voice, when he discussed this, carried something I had not heard in it before. Not excitement. Vane did not do excitement. A quality of focus, of absorption, that went past professional diligence into something closer to appetite. My problem, the question of whether the curse could be beaten, had become his project. And the project was engaging him in ways that routine librarian duties did not. I noticed. I did not understand what it meant. Neither did he. Torskus examined the cut on my face on the 4th day. It had not closed the way an Astartes wound closes. He measured it, sampled the tissue, ran it against the chapter's records, and concluded that trace warp residue on Lucius's saber had interfered with the coagulation response. A known phenomenon with demonic weapons, he said. The scar would be permanent. He recorded it as combat damage and moved on to the next test. On the 8th day, Vane said, "There is no sign of the curse." On the 16th day, he said, "I am cautiously optimistic." He paused, then added, unprompted, I have scanned over 300 Astartes in my career. No one has been this clean after exposure to a Slaaneshi artifact of this magnitude. Your neurological profile is genuinely remarkable. It was the closest thing to a compliment that Sethran Vane had ever given another living being. On the 31st day, he said, "I believe it worked." And for the first time in the 40 days I had watched him through the armor-glass partition, I saw his posture change. Not relaxation, something warmer than that. The subtle straightening of a man who has been carrying a weight and has just set it down, who has solved a problem that he was not certain could be solved, and who allows himself, just for a moment, just in the privacy of his own body, the quiet acknowledgement that his work was good. On the 40th day, Graveth Curin himself came to the quarantine chamber. He stood at the partition, looked at me with those calcified eyes, and spoke 2 sentences. "Well done. Report for duty." 2 sentences. By Graveth's standards, practically an oration. I left quarantine. I retrieved Terminus Absolute from the armory, where it had been locked in a null field containment case as a precaution. I resumed my duties as Sword Champion of the Hollow Saints. Interrogator Hale transmitted a formal report to the Ordo Hereticus, indicating that the curse of Lucius the Eternal had been circumvented through the deployment of a psychologically null state operative, and recommending that the methodology be studied for potential replication. She did not close the file. Ordo Hereticus does not close files on Slaaneshi exposure in Astartes. She left standing instructions with Torsk for quarterly biometric summaries transmitted under her seal and a servo skull in the Apothecarion to collect them. It was still there, hovering in the corner with its lens rotating, on the morning I showed Torsk the scar. The Hollow Saints do not celebrate, but there was a shift in the way my brothers looked at me when I passed them in the corridors, something subtler than admiration. A recognition that I had done a thing that should not have been possible, that I had killed a creature blessed by a god and walked away unchanged. Respect, or the closest thing to it that a chapter raised in ossuaries produces. I should have wondered when I had learned to read faces. I did not. I noted the behavioral change and continued with my duties. The relentless virtue broke orbit from Vossk Tertius and set course for the Calthemir system. The return voyage would take 11 days in the warp. Nothing happened on the first day, nothing happened on the second. On the third day, I noticed something that would have been insignificant to anyone else, a detail so minor that I almost did not process it at all. I was eating in the refectory. Standard nutrient rations, the same compressed protein blocks and mineral supplements that I had consumed twice daily for 143 years. I placed a block in my mouth, chewed, swallowed, and for the first time in longer than I could precisely remember, I tasted it. Not the chemical composition, not the texture which my enhanced senses had always catalogued. I tasted it the way I had tasted things as a child in the understacks, before the surgeries. It was not pleasant. The block tasted of chalk and rendered fat and something faintly metallic, and by any objective measure it was among the worst things a tongue can be asked to endure. But I tasted it. I chewed, I swallowed. I reached for the next block and paused. My hand was in the air, halfway to the tray, and it was steady, and my biometrics were flat, and there was nothing wrong. But I was pausing. Not to think, not to assess, to anticipate. I was looking forward to the next bite. Not because it would be good, but because it would be something. I put the block in my mouth and tasted it again. Chalk and fat and metal. Terrible and present. So present. I did not report it to Torsk or Vane. A space marine noticing the taste of his food is not a symptom of warp corruption. Marines taste things. Marines smell things. Marines process sensory data. The fact that I had not been doing so with any subjective awareness for over a decade was a function of my psychological condition, not my biology. It was reasonable to assume that the condition might fluctuate. I finished my meal. I tasted every bite. That night, ship night, the arbitrary division of hours that the relentless virtue maintained to preserve circadian function in its human crew, I lay in my cell and noticed the texture of the sleeping pallet beneath me. Coarse weave, pressure points where the material compressed under my weight. The temperature differential between the surface in contact with my body and the air above. These were things I had always been able to detect, but now I was detecting them with interest. The coarse weave was not pleasant, but it was detailed, and the detail was engaging in a way that made me run my fingertips across the fabric just to feel the patterns repeat. I closed my eyes. The dark was textured. I could hear the ship around me, the deep throb of the plasma drives, the whisper of recycled air through the ventilation system, the distant rhythm of a chapter serf's footsteps 6 decks below, transmitted through the hull in vibrations so faint that only Astarte's hearing could detect them. I had always been able to hear these things. Now I was listening to them. A door opened somewhere on the deck above, and the change in air pressure shifted the pitch of the ventilation by a quarter tone, and I tracked the shift with an attention that served no tactical purpose whatsoever. I lay there for 3 hours and listened to the ship breathe, and every minute of it was not unpleasant, and I told myself that this was recovery. The psychic null state I had inhabited for years was easing. Torsk had theorized something similar during one of his checkups, months before the mission. "You are not broken," he had said. "You are dormant. The architecture is intact. It is simply not receiving power." Perhaps killing Lucius, the sheer intensity of 8 minutes and 43 seconds at the absolute edge of what was possible, had thrown a switch somewhere deep in my neurology. That was the explanation I constructed. Logical, consistent with the available data, and comforting in the way that a locked door is comforting when you hear something moving in the corridor outside. On the 5th day of the return voyage, I noticed the light. I was walking through the main corridor of the habitation deck, a passage I had traversed thousands of times, and the lumen strips embedded in the ceiling caught my attention. They had always been there. Standard issue, harsh white, designed for function. But now I was seeing the way the light fell, the gradient of illumination from the strip's center to its edge, the subtle shift from white to pale amber, where the output degraded. The shadows cast by the corridor's structural ribs, parallel lines of dark and light that repeated in patterns which had a rhythm to them, a visual cadence that I found myself matching with my footsteps. Step on the light, step over the shadow, step on the light, step over the shadow. I was walking in tempo with the architecture. I stopped. I stood in the corridor and looked at the ceiling and tried to identify what I was doing, because Haereth Morn walked corridors to reach destinations. He did not synchronize his gait with lumen patterns. He did not notice gradients. And yet the patterns were beautiful. Beautiful the way a machine is beautiful when its components align. It had always been there. I had always been blind to it. And now my eyes were open, and the corridor was full of small, precise, meaningless beauties, and noticing them did not feel wrong. I reported to the practice cages. I drilled for 4 hours. During the drill, I noticed that the impact of my blade against the servitor's practice shield produced a sound, a clear metallic ring that sustained for approximately 2 seconds before decaying, and the sound was satisfying. A clean frequency, well-defined. The sword had always made this sound. I had never listened. I caught myself holding the follow-through of a killing stroke for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. I was holding the pose because my body was in a position that felt correct in some aesthetic sense. Weight balanced, blade extended, spine aligned, and the position was pleasing to occupy. Pleasing, not comfortable. The difference is important, and I should have recognized it then, and I did not. We arrived at Calthemir on the 11th day. I disembarked with the rest of the company and returned to my quarters in the Pale Stacks. The fortress monastery was unchanged. Stone corridors, skull-lined alcoves, the perpetual cool silence of a building constructed from compressed remains. I had lived here for most of my life. I had never found it oppressive or comforting or anything other than functional. Now it was quiet in a way that had texture. The silence was dense, layered, each absent sound leaving a shape behind, a negative space that I could almost feel. The catacombs beneath my quarters, which I had once crawled through as a child without thought, now hummed with a sub-audible resonance. The fortress monastery's deep foundations settling against the calcium bedrock. I could hear the Pale Stacks breathing. Very slowly, very quietly, the mountain of the dead expanding and contracting by fractions of a millimeter as thermal cycles shifted through its compressed mass. I stood in my quarters and listened to it for 20 minutes. I told myself that this was ordinary. I told myself many things, and they were all technically true, and none of them were the real reason. The real reason was patient, and had been watching me taste protein blocks and listen to corridors and notice light patterns with the indulgent attention of a parent watching a child discover that fire is warm. 14 days after our return to Calthemir, Torsk summoned me for a routine post-deployment medical evaluation. Standard procedure. Blood work, tissue samples, neural conductivity scans, the full catalog of post-combat diagnostics that ensure an Astartes' body is functioning within acceptable parameters. I sat in the apothecarion and submitted to the tests with the same compliance I had always shown. Torsk worked with his usual methodical efficiency, saying little, recording everything. When he was done, he sat across from me and looked at his data slate for a long time without speaking. "Your serotonin levels have increased," he said. I waited. "By 43% over your recorded baseline. That baseline was already anomalously low, so a 43% increase brings you closer to normal Astartes parameters, rather than pushing you beyond them. On its own, it is not concerning. The increase is consistent with a gradual restoration of normal neurochemical function." "But," I said, your sensory processing cortex is showing elevated activity across all input channels. Visual, auditory, tactile, olfactory. The increase is uniform, which is unusual. Typically, if one sense sharpens, others compensate. Yours are all sharpening simultaneously at the same rate, as if something is adjusting them from a central point." He looked up from the slate. "Have you noticed anything?" "Food has taste." Torsk looked at me as though I had filed a combat report with a footnote about the weather. "Food has... When you say it has taste, you mean..." "I mean that I experience the act of eating as a sensory event, rather than a caloric transaction. I notice textures, flavors, the distinction between different nutritional compounds. I also notice light patterns, acoustic properties of physical impacts, the resonance characteristics of the fortress monastery's deep structure, and the tactile qualities of surfaces that I interact with." Torsk set down his data slate. He looked at me the way an engineer looks at a bridge that is holding more weight than its design specifications allow. "How long?" "Since approximately the 3rd day of the return voyage." "That was 11 days ago. You did not report it." "There was nothing to report. Sensory awareness is not a pathology." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the data slate again. I am going to run the tests again. I am going to request that Sethrin Vane perform a deep psychic scan, and I am going to ask you a question that I need you to answer with absolute honesty. I have never lied to you, Torsk. I know. That is why I am asking. Do you enjoy what you are experiencing? The tastes, the sounds, the textures? Do they bring you pleasure? No, I said. They bring me detail. Torsk nodded slowly. He did not look reassured. Detail, he repeated. I will speak with Vane. Sethrin Vane came the following day. He sat in my quarters, lit no candles, spoke no litanies, simply opened his psyker's sight and looked at me for 45 minutes in silence. I sat still and let him look. His white eyes moved across me, or in slow, methodical sweeps, and occasionally his brow would furrow, and he would lean closer, as though trying to read small print in poor light. When he finished, he closed his eyes for a long time. Then he opened them, and they were his natural color again, dark gray, almost black, and the look in them was something I had never seen on Sethrin Vane's face before. You are clean, he said. I find no trace of warp contamination, no hooks, no threads, no parasitic entities, no residual curse signatures. You are psychically identical to what you were before the kill. Then, I did not say you were unchanged, he said. I said you were clean. Your psychic signature is the same. Your soul, insofar as I can read it, is intact. What has changed is not spiritual, it is neurological. Something in your brain is waking up. Pathways that have been dormant since your conditioning, possibly since before your conditioning, are reactivating. It is as if a surgeon had removed your ability to see color decades ago, and now, slowly, the color is returning. Is that consistent with the curse? He hesitated. In all my years alongside Sethrin Vane, I had never seen him hesitate. He dealt in certainties, in binary assessments of clean and tainted, safe and compromised. Hesitation was not in his operational vocabulary. No, he said. The curse, as documented, manifests through physical transformation and psychic corruption. Scars appear on the skin, hair falls out. The subject's features begin to reshape themselves into Lucius's likeness. There is always warp taint, a signature so distinctive that even a novice psyker could detect it. You have none of these symptoms. I have a scar. His eyes moved to my face, to the line running from temple to chin, and stayed there for perhaps 2 seconds. You have a blade wound that healed badly because the blade was demonic. Torsk documented it. It is a combat injury, Haereth, not a manifestation. Curse scars do not follow the path of an enemy's sword. They follow patterns that correspond to nothing in the victim's history. He shook his head once. What you are experiencing appears to be a natural neurological process, unrelated to the curse. He stood. He walked to the door. He stopped. I will monitor you. Daily. If anything changes, you will tell me immediately. I will. He left. I sat in my quarters and listened to the silence of the pale stacks and noticed that the bone-stone walls had a faint smell, mineral and dry like chalk dust in still air. Not pleasant, not unpleasant, simply a smell I had been surrounded by for my entire life and never once registered. The weeks that followed were the most dangerous period of my existence, and I did not know it because what was happening to me felt like healing. My senses continued to sharpen, gradually, uniformly, each day bringing a new layer of detail to a world that I had experienced as a flat, gray, functional landscape for over a decade. Colors became more vivid. I noticed that the chapter serfs who maintained the pale stacks wore their robes in subtly different ways. one with the hood always raised, another with a particular fold in the left sleeve, a third who limped on his right leg in a rhythm that I found unexpectedly distinct, identifiable across 3 corridors by sound alone. These were the kinds of observations that I should have been making all along, that any functioning Astartes would make as a matter of course. Their absence had been the anomaly, not their presence. I was recovering. That is what I told Torsk during our checkups. That is what I told Vane during his daily scans. That is what I told myself every morning when I woke up, and the first thing I did was run my fingertips across the sleeping pallet to feel the weave because the texture had become the first sensation of each day, and it grounded me, and grounding felt like something I needed. I trained harder than I had in years. Training had become interesting again. My form was better than it had been during the Lucius fight. I was faster. My reactions were sharper. Polev remarked on it during a sparring session, and the remark carried a note of surprise that was, by Hollow Saints standards, practically a standing ovation. "Your blade work," he said, catching his breath behind the practice barrier. "It is different." "Different how?" He paused, searching for the word. Polev was not a man given to analysis. He was a line sergeant, a wall of ceramite and bolter discipline, as reliable as gravity and approximately as eloquent. The fact that he had noticed a change in my fighting style at all was significant. "Smoother," he said. "You used to fight like you were hammering nails. Now you fight like you are drawing lines." I considered that. He was right. My combat form had shifted. The fundamental techniques were the same, the Imperial Fist school, heavy and direct, but the transitions between them had become more fluid. I was connecting moves that had previously been discrete actions, flowing from cut to parry to riposte in continuous arcs rather than in the staccato sequence of strike, reset, strike that characterized my training. The movements were not elegant. Elegant would have been a warning sign that even I might have recognized. They were efficient in a way that approached elegance from the opposite direction. Not beauty aspiring to function, but function refined to the point where beauty began to emerge unbidden. I did not think about where this fluidity came from. I should have. If I had stopped to analyze the specific combat transitions that were appearing in my form, the particular way I shifted weight during a high-to-low combination, the rotation of my wrist during a parry that I had never been taught, I might have recognized them. There was one moment during a sparring bout 3 days after Polev's observation when I executed a riposte that I had never learned. A lateral cut that flowed into a reverse grip transition, the blade rolling across my knuckles and resettling into a backhand position in a single seamless motion. It was not an Imperial Fists technique. It was not a technique from any school I had studied. But my hands knew it. My wrists knew the rotation. My shoulders knew the angle. And somewhere in the deeper archives of my tactical memory, where the data from Interrogator Hale's combat footage was stored, a connection almost formed. Almost linked this unnamed technique to the footage of Lucius fighting a Dark Eldar incubus in the Gethys cluster. The same rolling blade transition, the same impossible fluidity. The connection almost formed. I let it pass. I did not chase it. Recognition requires context, and context requires the willingness to look, and I did not want to look. Not because I was afraid, because looking would mean admitting that the recovery I was experiencing was not a recovery at all. 83 days after the kill, I was alone in the practice cages, running a solo form against 3 suspended target dummies. It was late in the 3rd watch, the fortress monastery quiet, most of my brothers in their cells or at prayer. The lumen strips were at half power, casting the cage in a warm amber glow that I found. I paused at the word in my own mind and pushed through it, that I found aesthetically coherent. The light complemented the motion. The shadows my blade cast as it moved through the air were sharp and clean and repetitive, and I found myself adjusting my angle of attack by fractions of a degree, not for tactical advantage, but because the shadows looked better at the adjusted angle. I stopped. I stood in the practice cage, blade extended, breathing hard, and for the first time since the first protein block on the return voyage, I felt something that I could not classify as mere awareness, or detail, or engagement. I felt the desire to do it again. Not the drill, the adjustment. The moment where I had tilted my blade by 2 degrees and the shadow on the floor had changed from a harsh line to a curve, and the curve had been more satisfying than the line, and the satisfaction. The satisfaction. There it was, small, quiet. A match struck in a dark room, not an inferno, not a flood. A single point of warmth in the cold architecture of my mind, tiny enough to dismiss, tiny enough to explain away, tiny enough that I could tell myself it was nothing and almost believe it. Almost. I lowered my blade. I looked at my left arm. I looked at the inside of my forearm, where the body glove ended and bare skin was exposed. And there, visible in the amber half-light of the practice cage, I saw what should have been impossible. A scar, thin, silver, running from the inside of my wrist to the crease of my elbow. Not a wound scar. The cut Lucius had given me on my forearm had been on the other arm, and it had healed cleanly. This was something else. A line in my skin that had not been there that morning, tracing a path that looked random until you followed it with your fingertip and felt the pattern in it, the deliberate, almost artistic curve of a mark that had been placed, not sustained. I traced it. The skin around it was smooth and undisturbed, no inflammation, no tenderness. The scar was simply there, as if it had grown from inside, rising through the layers of my dermis like something surfacing from deep water. I stood very still. I breathed. There were options. Call Torsk, call Vane. Walk to the Reclusium and kneel at the Emperor's altar and pray, which I had never done in my life, and which would not have helped. But there is nothing else to do when the door you thought was locked turns out to have been open the whole time. I did none of those things. I pulled my body glove down over my forearm. I sheathed Terminus Absolute. I walked to my quarters in the pale stacks. I lay on my sleeping pallet and felt the coarse weave against my skin and listened to the bone stone breathe and looked at the ceiling and waited for the panic to come. It did not come. Instead, what came was understanding. It came slowly, like water filling a basin from a crack in the floor, rising by imperceptible degrees until I was standing in it. Vane had been right. I was clean. No warp taint, no hooks, no threads. The curse was not working through my soul. The soul was only the trophy. The mechanism was the flesh. The architecture Vane had correctly identified as reactivating, and Torsk had correctly identified as anomalous, and both of them had filed as recovery. Slaanesh had not triggered the curse through my satisfaction in the kill. I had felt no satisfaction. The god of excess had looked at me, at the hollow, empty, emotionally dead weapon that the hollow saints had aimed at his champion, and had not tried to find satisfaction where none existed. Instead, the Dark Prince had created it. The satisfaction of sensation itself, the satisfaction of feeling anything at all after years of feeling nothing. I had not taken pleasure in killing Lucius. I had taken pleasure in being alive afterward. As the thought formed, a second scar appeared. I watched it happen. a line of silver rising through the skin of my other forearm, slow and deliberate, following a nerve pathway that had carried the sensation of the coarse weave against my fingertips every night since the third day of the return voyage. The curse was marking its territory. Every nerve it had reawakened, it was now claiming. And I understood. For a man who had felt nothing for years, even the taste of a bad protein block was excess. The texture of a sleeping pallet was excess. The flicker of a lumen strip was excess. And excess belonged to Slaanesh. Every sensation I had experienced had been a thread, a neurological thread, chemical, physical. A slow, patient, invisible rewiring of the reward centers that my psychological damage had shut down, conducted not through sorcery, but through the subtlest possible application of divine will. A nudge here, a reconnection there, the careful restoration of the capacity for pleasure in a mind that had been specifically selected because it lacked that capacity. The Dark Prince had followed the rules exactly. The curse required satisfaction. So Slaanesh gave me the ability to feel it. The curse had not been triggered on the plaza of Vossk Tertius. It had been triggered here in the quiet corridors of Calthamir every time I noticed something beautiful and did not look away. The scars on my arms were proof, not the first marks the curse had left on me. That had been the line on my face. Months earlier, the one I had explained away as a demon blade's residue. These were the first I could not explain away. 83 days of transformation operating beneath the threshold of detection, hidden by kindness. The cruelest thing Slaanesh had done was make me feel whole again before taking everything away. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark and felt the coarse weave against my skin and hated the pleasure it brought me. And the hatred was new too, and I wondered if even that was part of the design. I told Torsk the next morning. I pulled back my body glove and showed him the scar, and I watched his face change in ways that Hollow Saints' faces are not supposed to change. He went pale. Not the pale of fear, but the pale of a man watching a structural failure in something he had certified as sound. He scanned the scar. Tissue analysis, cellular composition, depth mapping. He ran every diagnostic in his augmented toolkit, and when he was done, he sat down, slowly, on a metal stool that was not designed for someone in full Astartes plate, and he said the one word that I had already known he would say. Scar tissue, subdermal origin, no wound track, no foreign body, no infection vector. The tissue is growing from inside your dermis, following a pattern that does not correspond to any known pathological or immunological response. He paused. The pattern is consistent with the scar tissue documented in the early stages of Lucius curse transformation cases. I know. Your biometrics showed no spike. Your psychic scans showed no taint. Vane declared you clean. Vane was not wrong. The taint is not psychic. It is neurological. The curse found a way around the safeguard, Torsk. I did not feel satisfaction in killing Lucius. Slaanesh restored my capacity to feel satisfaction in everything else, and that was enough. Torsk stared at me. In 143 years, I had never seen the apothecary speechless. He was a man of clinical precision, of measured responses and calibrated analysis. But he was staring at me now the way a chirurgeon stares at a tumor that has grown around the aorta. Impossible to remove, impossible to leave. The patient already dead from a technical standpoint, even though the heart is still beating. How long? He said. 84 days. The sensory changes began on the third day of the return voyage. 84 days. His voice was flat, professional, falling back on protocol because there was nothing else to fall back on. Have there been other scars? I pulled back both sleeves. 3 more lines had appeared overnight, thin silver, following paths across my forearms that looked random, but when viewed together, formed the beginning of a network. A web. I had been mapping them in the dark, tracing them with my fingertips while I lay awake, and the pattern was not random. It was not random at all. The lines followed the architecture of my nervous system. They were tracing the pathways that had been reawakening. Every nerve that had fired with renewed sensation now had a scar above it, like a river marked on a map. Torsk activated the emergency Vox. Within an hour, I was back in the Reclusium, seated in the same chair where I had received the original briefing, under the petrified ribcage of the ancient hive whale. Graveth Kyren stood at the head of the table, his stone face revealing nothing. Sethrin Vane sat beside him, his psychic hood inactive, his eyes dark and focused. Chaplain Drovek held his Crozius like a weapon, which, given the circumstances, it probably was. Torsk presented his findings. The room listened. Graveth did not interrupt. Vane did not interrupt. Drovek's grip on the Crozius tightened by increments, but he said nothing. When Torsk finished, the silence in the Reclusium was the kind that has mass. "Options!" Graveth's voice cut it like a blade. Torsk spoke first. "Radical surgical intervention. Remove the affected nerve pathways before the transformation can progress. Strip the sensory architecture back to combat minimum function. Effectively reverse the reactivation. Return him to the null state." "Will that stop the curse?" "Unknown. The scar tissue is subdermal. If it is being generated by the curse's mechanism, removing the nerve pathways may not address the root cause. Might. There is no certainty in this." In the silence that followed, I could hear the hive whale's petrified ribs creaking above us. Even the architecture was uncomfortable. Graveth turned to Vane. "Psychic options." Vane was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful in a way that made me pay very close attention. "I can attempt a deep-level psychic purge, reach into his mind and seal the connections that are reopening. Close the doors that Slanesh has opened. It would be permanent. It would destroy the architecture entirely. He would lose the capacity to feel sensation beyond the baseline required for combat function. Pain and spatial awareness would remain. Everything else would be gone." "You are describing a lobotomy." "I am describing survival." "Those two things are not always compatible." Drovek spoke for the first time since the briefing. "The alternative is clear. If the transformation cannot be halted, the subject must be terminated before it can complete. A clean death. The Emperor's mercy." "You have been carrying that word around for 84 days, Chaplain." He did not deny it. He set the Crozius across his knees, which is what Drovek does instead of admitting anything. "The interrogator's testament said the condition is pity. I have watched you serve for a century, and I have never once been able to pity you, because there was nothing in you to pity. That has changed." He looked at me the way a man looks at a wound he is about to clean. "If the transformation completes, what stands up will not be Haereth Morn, and I will be a chaplain standing over the remains of a brother, holding a weapon, feeling exactly what the testament describes." Torsk was on his feet before Drovek finished. He is not a man who raises his voice, and he did not raise it then, which made it worse. "You are proposing to let Lucius the Eternal fully incarnate inside this fortress, in the Reclusium, 40 meters below the chapter master's cell." "I am. He will kill you in the time it takes to draw breath, then Graveth, then whoever is in the corridor. He is the finest blade in the galaxy, and you are a priest with a pistol." "Yes." Drovek said it without any particular weight, the way you confirm a fuel figure. That is the cost, and it is not an argument against the plan. It is a specification. Null field generator at full output. Adamantine restraints, 4 points, rated for dreadnought load. 2 brothers of the first company in Terminator plate on the door with the seals blown, so that if I fail, they are what he meets, and nobody in the chamber but me, because the moment there are 2 of us in there, one of them is thinking about survival, and that is not pity. Restraints will not hold him, Torsk said. No, probably not. Nobody has ever attempted to hold a returning Lucius, because nobody has ever had 8 hours of warning before one arrived, so there is no data, and I will not pretend otherwise. Drovek's hands had not moved from the Croceus. The armor is sustained by the warp. The chains are sustained by metallurgy. My honest estimate is that they buy between 4 and 9 seconds. That is the window. It is sufficient because I only need to be looking at him. And if the field holds him and you cannot do it, that was Graveth, then I will have failed, and the chapter will have lost a chaplain and a sword champion in one afternoon, and the situation will be exactly what it is now, except worse. I am not offering a good plan. I am offering the only one anybody has described that ends him permanently. Torsk tried once more. He said that if it came to it, he would do it himself, and he had the standing to say it, because administering the Emperor's mercy to a dying brother is an apothecary's duty, and he had performed it 11 times. Drovek shook his head before the sentence was finished. No, you care about him. The chaplain's voice did not change. What you would feel in that room is grief. And grief is not pity. Grief looks across. Pity looks down at something finished, something that can no longer be helped, something you never had any stake in. I have no stake in Haereth Morn. I never did. That is my qualification. I sat and listened to a man explain in a level and courteous tone that his coldness toward me over the course of a century was the asset that might save the galaxy, and I found that I had no argument against any part of it. That is a poor bargain for me, I said. It is the best bargain available to the Imperium. Graveth asked how long it would take to prepare the chamber. Torsk said 6 hours for the null field emitters to be moved from the reliquary vault and calibrated. The restraints were faster. Vane added a technical constraint in the same flat tone he used for everything. A null field cannot be active during a psychic purge. It suppresses warp work indiscriminately, his and everything else's. The field goes up after the purge, or not at all. Nobody in the room found that remarkable. It is the kind of constraint that appears in every operation an Astartes chapter has ever run. 2 capabilities that cannot occupy the same hour. Graveth simply sequenced them. Purge first, unshielded. Field and restraints after, if the purge failed. 2 brothers of the first company were sent to stand at the Reclusium door in the interval, which everyone agreed was sufficient, because the Reclusium has 1 door. It has 1 door on the fortress plans. It also has a low arch in the far wall behind the altar, which leads to the ossuary passages the chapter uses to carry its dead down into the stacks. The passages run one way, down, into places nobody returns from under their own power. They are not marked as exits because they are not exits. Nobody has ever posted a guard on them for the same reason nobody posts a guard on a grave. Graveth raised a hand. The room fell silent. He looked at me for a long time, and in his stone face I saw the faintest expression of something that might have been grief. Vane, perform the purge. If it fails, we prepare the chamber and we move to Drovek's solution. They cleared the Reclusium. Vane and I remained. He sat across from me, close enough to touch, and powered up his psychic hood. The crystalline matrix hummed, and the temperature in the room dropped by 10 degrees as he gathered the warp to him. This will hurt. I know. Not your body, your mind. I am going to reach into the parts of your brain that make you who you are and burn them out. When I am done, you will be functional. You will be a weapon. You will not be a person. I was not a person before Vossk Tertius. I was a weapon that ate and slept and occasionally made observations that other weapons interpreted as personality. If I go back to that, I lose nothing of value. Vane looked at me. His dark gray eyes held something that I wished I could not read, because the ability to read it was itself evidence of the curse's progress. Pity. He pitied me. Not for what I was about to lose, but because the version of me that would exist after the purge would not be capable of understanding what had been taken. He reached out with his mind. I felt it happen. A force concentrated and sharp driving through the outer layers of my consciousness. I felt him enter the spaces where the reawakened pathways lived, the channels that carried taste and texture and light, and the warm, terrible pleasure of being alive in a body that could feel. He found them. He mapped them. He prepared to cut. And then he stopped. I opened my eyes. Vane was sitting rigid in his chair, his psychic hood blazing with light, his hands gripping the arms of the seat so hard that the wood cracked beneath his gauntlets. His eyes were white with shock. "What?" "It is in me." The words came out flat, stripped of everything. The threads, neural, chemical, the same pathways that are reactivating in you. They are growing in me. I did not move. "Every time I opened my sight and looked into your mind," Vane continued, his voice very steady, very precise, "I took satisfaction in my own accuracy, in the precision of my diagnosis. I certified your emotional state, Haereth. I built the foundation the mission rested on, and being right felt good." His hands were still locked on the chair's arms, the cracked wood splintering further under his grip. Being the architect of the kill, even if my hands never held the blade. The munitions worker. The thought arrived cold and precise. The Forge World munitions worker from Hale's briefing. The one who was consumed by the curse because she made the shell that killed Lucius. She never saw him. She simply took pride in her work, and that work happened to end his life. And that was enough. "The chain," I said. Vane looked at me. "You are not the killer, Vane. Neither was the munitions worker. The curse does not need the killer. It needs the satisfaction. Any satisfaction connected to the kill by any number of links." I was building it as I spoke, each piece locking into the next with a precision that terrified me because the picture it formed was perfect. Graveth for authorizing the mission, Torsk for designing the monitoring protocol, Drovek for blessing the blade, Polev for leading the squad, everyone who contributed, everyone who took any measure of pride in their role. Then it is in all of us at once. Vane's hands had not left the chair. Lucius cannot wear 6 bodies. He does not need 6. The rest arrived as I said it. He needs 1. The others are the queue. Vane went very still. Think about what happens if Drovek shoots me tonight. The transformation stops. The vessel is destroyed, and the curse is not. Because the curse is not in my body. It is in the chain, and the chain has other links. It moves down. It finds the next person who took satisfaction in the work, and it begins again in them. And this time, nobody is watching for it, because as far as the chapter is concerned, the problem was solved with a bolt round. I heard my own voice, level and clinical, describing the shape of a trap that had been closing for 84 days. Kill me and you inherit it. That is the mechanism. That is why the Death Watch brothers' death did not end anything, and why the servitor's death did not end anything. Slaanesh does not lose the queue when he loses the vessel. Vane was shaking. A space marine librarian, a man who had bent the warp to his will for 200 years, was shaking in his chair. And the more people who try to help, who intervene, who feel the satisfaction of attempting to save you, the longer the queue gets. Silence. Then another connection, colder than the last. Hale, Interrogator Hale, filed a report, a formal recommendation that the methodology be studied for potential replication. She was proud of it. I could see it when she drafted the transmit authorization, a tight little smile. Professional. If the Inquisition replicates the methodology vein, if they find more emotionally null operatives and send them against Lucius, they will create more links. Every operative, every handler, every Inquisitor who authorized the mission and felt the quiet pride of a command, an assembly line of victims manufactured by the very institution that was supposed to protect them. Slaanesh does not even have to lift a finger. The Imperium will do the work for him. The demonic observer on Vossk Tertius, the thing that had watched, not fought. It had been there to confirm that the experiment worked, not for the Imperium, but for Slaanesh, a proof of concept. And we had delivered the results. The curse of Lucius the Eternal was not a weapon aimed at a single target. It was a line of them, standing in order, each one waiting for the one in front to fall. Everyone who had been part of the kill, everyone who cared enough to try to fix it. The act of caring was the trap. The act of trying to help moved you up the queue. Slaanesh had not been patient. Slaanesh had been thorough. "You have to stop the purge," I said. Vane looked at me. The shaking had stopped. Something had solidified behind his eyes. Not calm, but acceptance. The particular kind of acceptance that warriors develop when the tactical situation has deteriorated past the point of salvage, and the only remaining decision is how to spend what is left. If I stop, the transformation will continue. Yes. Drovek's plan ends Lucius. Yours does not. I know. There was nothing to add to that, so I did not add anything. His requires that I be scraped out of my own skull first. I am not going to be in the room for it. Vane waited for the rest. 84 days ago, there would have been no rest. A weapon does not have preferences, and I would have knelt down in that chamber and let Drovek work. There was nothing underneath this except the wanting, and the wanting was new, and it was going to cost 10,000 years of somebody else's dead. Say it plainly, Vane said. Lucius walks out of Calthamir wearing my face, and every death after that is mine. I have done the arithmetic. I am going anyway. He understood what I was asking. I watched him understand it, and I watched him weigh the fact that helping me was itself a satisfaction. Another turn of the screw, another inch of thread pulled through his own skin. He did it anyway. That was the only clean choice anyone made in this entire affair, and he made it in about 4 seconds, sitting in a cracked chair under the ribs of a dead hive whale. He keyed the chamber Vox. Purge initiated, he said, in the flat register of a man filing a routine report. Deep-tier neural work, 6 hours minimum. He chose the figure deliberately. It was the same 6 hours Torsk had quoted for the emitters, which meant nobody would query it. The 2 operations would appear to be running in parallel, and the chamber would be ready at the moment the purge concluded. Interruption at any stage is lethal to both participants. I require the chamber sealed and unobserved until I signal, and no armed presence within 40 meters of the door. Proximity of active weaponry destabilizes the working. The Vox was silent for 3 seconds. Then Gravith's voice came back. 2 words, no inflection. Understood. Proceed. Vane closed the channel and looked at the far wall, at the low arch behind the altar. It comes out below the training halls. Nobody uses it except the burial details, and there is no burial detail today. There will be by tomorrow. Yes, he did not smile. Sethrin Vane had never smiled in my presence and did not begin then. 6 hours. After that, I opened the door and tell him what I did. I stood. I picked up Terminus Absolute from where it rested against the wall. I checked the blade, a reflex so ingrained that I performed it without conscious thought, running my thumb along the flat to feel for imperfections, tilting it to catch the light. I stopped. I was tilting the blade to catch the light, not to inspect it, to see the way the null wards reflected the lumen strips, the pattern of cold blue and warm amber that played across the hexagrammic script. I was admiring my own sword. I was finding beauty in a weapon designed to kill. Then I did the other thing, which took longer and hurt more. Torsk's monitors had been in me since the day before we made for Vossk. 17 sensors, subdermal, threaded along the major nerve trunks and into the pericardial wall, transmitting continuously to the apothecarion. They had recorded the duel to the second. They had recorded 84 days of a man discovering that food has taste. They were still transmitting, and they would keep transmitting from 400 meters of solid stone, because Torsk builds for the battlefield and not for the courtroom. Nobody was reading the feed. Torsk was 2 levels down in the reliquary vault with a work detail, moving null field emitters that weigh as much as a rhino apiece, and calibrating them by hand, which is a 6-hour job and does not permit an auspex in the other hand. That was the arithmetic I did, and it was correct, and it bought me the head start. I stripped the pauldrons and the breastplate and set them against the altar. Then I took the sensors out with my gauntlet knife. 14 came away clean. 2 required cutting. The last one, seated against the pericardium, I could not reach without opening my own chest, so I severed the transmitter lead and left the emitter where it was, dead in the muscle. It took 11 minutes. My hands were steady. My Laraman cells sealed everything as fast as I opened it, and the procedure was in the most literal sense painless. Torsk would come back up to an empty apothecarion in 6 hours and pull the record. 17 lines going flat in sequence over 11 minutes. Not a struggle, not a seizure. A man working steadily through a list. Vane watched all of it. He did not offer to help, and he did not look away. And at the 9th minute he was still there with his hands on the arms of the broken chair, holding his face perfectly level. I left the sensors on the reclusium floor in a small pile, still faintly wet. I left the plate where I had set it, against the altar, because what comes out of a man at the end of this wears armor of its own. I took the body glove, the gauntlet knife, and Terminus Absolute, and that was all of it. More scars had appeared while I worked. I could feel them without looking. A tightness beneath the skin of my arms, my chest, my neck, like wire being drawn through tissue. The network was growing. The map of my reawakened nerves was spreading across my body, and I knew with the same cold certainty that had always been my defining trait that eventually the map would be complete. And when it was complete, the lines would shift. They would thicken. They would carve through my skin in earnest, not silver threads, but deep furrows. My features would change. My hair would fall out in clumps. The thing that I was would dissolve. The thing that Lucius is would emerge, and all that would remain of Haereth Morn would be a screaming face pressed into the armor of shrieking souls, aware and suffering and conscious for eternity. I went through the arch. Vane did not follow me. He stayed in the sealed chamber with his hood powered and his hands on the arms of a broken chair, holding 6 hours open with a lie that would cost him whatever was left of his standing. I walked through the corridors of the pale stacks, and every step was a sensation, and every sensation was a thread, and every thread pulled tighter. The bone-stone walls breathed around me. I could hear the compressed dead shifting in their eternal sleep, and the sound was beautiful, and I hated that it was beautiful. The hatred was sharp and vivid and alive in a way that nothing in my life had been for years, which meant the hatred was a sensation too, which meant it was another thread. They all led to the same place. I passed a chapter serf in the ossuary passage. She flattened against the wall to let me by, the way serfs do, and did not look up. She was carrying a tray of maintenance tools, her steps quick and purposeful, her hood drawn low. I was moving fast. 6 hours is not a long time to disappear inside a mountain, and I registered all of it anyway. Her hands gripping the tray with the habitual competence of someone who had performed this task 1,000 times. The rhythm of her breathing, the fold of her robe at the shoulder, the same fold I had catalogued weeks ago, the one that made her identifiable at a distance. I did not slow down, and I could not stop looking. These details had been gifts, signs of my recovery, evidence that I was healing, that the hollow man was becoming whole again. They were chains. I descended into the deep catacombs, below the fortress monastery, below the training halls and the apothecarium and the reclusium, below the level where chapter serfs maintained the infrastructure, into the old tunnels that I had crawled through as a child. The understacks, where the bonestone was raw and unworked, where the compressed remains of 1 billion nameless dead formed walls and floors and ceilings of calcium rock, where the air was dry and still and smelled of mineral dust and deep time. I had mapped these tunnels as a boy. I knew them better than anyone alive. I knew the passages that went nowhere, the chambers that had collapsed, the deep shafts that descended into the roots of the pale stacks where the strata met the planet's actual bedrock, and the weight of the dead above pressed down with the force of geological time. I found the chamber. My chamber. The spherical hollow in the oldest stratum, the one I had sat in as a tunnel rat child when the shifts ended and the other children went to eat. It was unchanged. The walls were smooth. The floor was curved. The rock was cool and ancient and silent. I had come here because it was nothing, and I had been nothing, and I had thought that returning to the place where I had first been nothing might somehow reverse the process, might somehow drain the color back out of the world, strip the taste from the air, close the doors, and seal me back inside the empty shell that had been strong enough to kill a god's champion. I sat down. I placed Terminus Absolute across my knees. I tried to feel nothing. I could not. The curse had done its work too well. Every surface I touched, every sound I heard, every breath I drew was saturated with detail, with presence, with the raw, overwhelming fact of sensation. The compressed stone was cool against my legs. The air tasted of chalk. The silence had a pitch, a frequency, a resonance that hummed in the hollow of my chest. I was drowning in perception. Every sense was a river in flood, and there was no dam, no wall, no way to shut the water out because the dam was the thing that Slaanesh had dismantled, and you cannot rebuild a dam from inside the flood. I have been here some time. I do not know how long. Long enough that the search parties have worked their way down through 3 strata of tunnels without finding me, which is what happens when the man you are looking for mapped these passages as a child, and you did not. Long enough that the changes have stopped being subtle. I tried to remember what it had been like before. The emptiness, the gray, the flat landscape of a mind that processed data without experiencing it. I tried to reach back into that void and pull it over myself, to smother the sensation in the same nothingness that had once been my entire existence. But the void was gone, replaced by the terrible, magnificent weight of being a conscious thing in a material universe. I could not close the door that the Dark Prince had opened, because the act of trying to close it was itself an act of will, and will required engagement, and engagement required awareness, and awareness was the trap. Another line opened across my forearm as I sat there. I watched the silver surface through my skin, tracing a nerve I had used to feel the smooth walls of this chamber. Even now, even sitting still, even trying to feel nothing, I was feeling the stone, and the feeling was being marked and claimed. The Hollow Saints believed they had found a loophole, a warrior so damaged, so empty, that he could kill without feeling. They were right. I killed without feeling. But Slaanesh did not need the feeling to be there at the moment of the kill. The Dark Prince needed it to exist at all, anywhere, at any point in the chain, in any quantity. And the Dark Prince was willing to wait, to rebuild, to heal the very wound that had made me useful, because a healed wound is a satisfied wound, and satisfaction in any dose was enough. The scars are spreading as I speak. I can feel them crawling across my scalp, tracing patterns behind my ears, down the back of my neck. My hair is thinning. There are strands on my fingers when I run my hands through it, fine strands, pale, losing their color. When I touch my face now, the bone structure beneath my cheeks is wrong. The maxilla shifted forward, the orbital ridges thinning, the jaw narrowing into a shape that was never mine. My eyes ache the way muscles ache when they are being reshaped under tension. I have not seen my reflection since entering the catacombs, but I know that my eyes are no longer the color they were when I walked out of the Reclusiam. I can feel the change in the way the dark looks, a bruised warmth, as if I am seeing through a filter of pale violet. My face itches from inside, from the bones shifting beneath the skin, from features rearranging themselves into a configuration that I have seen in picked captures and combat footage, and nightmares that I did not used to have because I did not used to dream. I dream now. Another gift from the god who healed me. I dream of the plaza on Vossk Tertius. I dream of the faces in the armor, the screaming mouths and rolling eyes, and in the dream they are not screaming in pain. They are screaming because they are trying to tell me something. They are trying to warn the next one, the next hollow man, the next empty vessel that someone will fill with purpose and aim at the thing that cannot die. There is a voice. Not Lucius's voice, not yet. A quieter one, living in the space between my thoughts, in the gap between one heartbeat and the next. It hums, a single note, sustained and perfect, resonating with the scar tissue spreading across my body, and every sensation it touches gets brighter. The voice is pleased. The voice is patient and it is kind. And it is the worst thing I have ever heard, because it sounds like everything I ever wanted. I hear footsteps in the tunnel above. Someone is looking for me. Torsk, probably. Or Drovek. Drovek's specification was not thoroughness for its own sake. The null field, the 4-point restraints, the 2 first company brothers on the door. He was describing the minimum conditions under which a priest with a pistol survives long enough to feel anything. None of that exists down here. There is a spherical hole in the rock, and a man coming along a tunnel he has never walked, alone. Not because the passage is narrow, but because the understacks branch. Every 100 meters, the way splits 3 or 4 ways, most of them ending in collapse, and the only person alive who knows which ones go anywhere is sitting in this chamber. A search party has to spread out. Whoever finds the right branch finds it by himself, with the rest of his brothers half a kilometer of stone away and no Vosks that will carry through it. What will be sitting here by then is the finest swordsman the galaxy has produced, wearing armor made of screaming faces at the exact moment of his return, with no field and no chains and no first company on the door. Drovek will not get to pity anything. He will get about a second and a half. Let them come. Let them find me here in the dark, in this spherical chamber of the compressed dead, where I sat as a child and felt nothing, and thought that nothing was safety. Slaanesh does not need me specifically. He needs the satisfaction, and there is always satisfaction, somewhere in the queue. There is always someone who takes pride in their work, or relief in their survival, or the quiet, unspoken pleasure of a job done well. There is always a link. My name was Haereth Morn, sword champion of the Hollow Saints, and I killed Lucius the Eternal on Vossk Tertius, with no satisfaction, and no pride, and no pleasure, and no feeling of any kind. And the thing that wears the universe like a mask looked at my emptiness and saw not a defense but a canvas. And the thing painted, and the painting was beautiful, and beauty was enough. The scar across my face is deepening. It follows the same line that Lucius's saber traced during our duel, the cut from temple to chin that he gave me as a gift, as a line drawn in my flesh that said, I was here. Vane told me that curse scars never follow the path of an enemy's blade. He had 10,000 years of records behind him. Lucius chose where to cut me. The line is widening. When I touch it, I can feel something moving underneath, something that is not me settling into a shape that will become permanent. I can still feel the stone beneath me. I can still hear the mountain of the dead breathing in its slow, ancient rhythm. I can still taste the chalk dust air and smell the mineral silence and feel the weight of 1 billion compressed lives pressing down from above. I can feel everything. That is the punishment. That is the point. That is what really happens to the warrior who kills Lucius the Eternal.